This is the Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and I am so happy to welcome back once again, Matt Lewis. Welcome.
Thank you for lying and for having me back yet again. I must be doing something right.
I wasn't lying. I do like having you on the show. Well, I asked you on today. Sometimes I like having conversations with you about history. You're easy to talk to. And sometimes I'm like, what can we talk about? Because I want to have you back on the show. What subject can we reach for today? And today we're going to look at one that probably is going to surprise everybody because we joked about this. Who the hell is Henry III, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I wrote a book about the man and I find difficulty answering that question. So, yeah, I think he's one of those people. If you ask most people when Henry III reigned, they probably couldn't tell you. Might not even be able to tell you what century. And if you ask most people, who came between King John and Edward I, they would quite possibly not be able to fill in that blank between Magna Carta and the conquests of Wales and Scotland.
Yeah.
But the answer to both is kind of Henry III. He is in there in the 13th century for the longest reign of any medieval king of England, a reign that wouldn't be beaten until we get to the Georgians, several centuries later. And in between the huge crises of the reign of King John, his dad, and what I considered, at least in England, and I know that's controversial to say, but the successes of the reign of his son, Edward I.
Yeah, it's funny, you talk about King John and Edward I, but to me, as somebody who has loved medieval history, maybe not as much as you, but it does fascinate me. I go from Henry II to Edward I. I skip in between there because that, to me, those two are more fascinating.
That's it. I think, there are those huge characters, Henry II, John because of what goes on during his reign, Edward because of what he achieves, Edward III because you get into the 100 Years' War, and Henry V because you've got Agincourt. They're a standout kings, but there are some really interesting ones. And one of the things I always think about when we talk about kings like Henry III, and hopefully we'll be able to get to a bit of this about him, is that he's someone who, if I had to pick between someone to rule my country today, between Henry III and Henry V, Henry III is getting my vote in the ballot box all day, every day. It's the slightly different standards by which we judge medieval rulers and what people in their time expected of them, and therefore what we expect them to have achieved or done to measure success or failure. But the majority of people that we consider to be good medieval kings are not people that you would want to rule over you today. They tend to be picking fights and starting wars all over the place, taxing the country to the eyeballs to pay for it. And actually, when you look at some of the important things that come out of Henry's reign, they are absolutely foundational for the England and the Britain that emerges over the centuries that follow.
Can we talk about the throne that Henry III came into? Because like so many kings in English history and Scottish history, especially, he came to the throne at a very young age, didn't he?
He did. And I mean, if we're going to talk about the throne, it's cracked, it's broken, it's wobbly, because John's been sitting on it for 17 years by this point and has completely trashed the country. We've just had the Magna Carta crisis. We're in the midst of the First Barons' War. The barons, the northern barons and rebel barons of England have appealed to the heir to the King of France to come over here and be the new King of England. So we're in the midst of a French invasion, a rebellion, a civil war within England as well. And that's aside from the fact that, people often forget about John in his dealings with the church. So John has a really bad relationship with the church for most of his reign, gets excommunicated. England is placed under an interdict, which means there's no church services. Nobody is getting kind of married, baptized, properly buried. There's no masses being heard or anything like that. So it's a serious crisis for a country that is deeply, deeply religious. And John's way out of this is to give England to the papacy. So he actually hands the whole kingdom of England over to the Pope and becomes a liege man of the Pope, and England becomes a papal fiefdom. And that is never legally undone until the reign of Henry VIII and the break with Rome, effectively. So John has completely and utterly messed everything up. By almost every measure of a medieval king and a modern day ruler, he is absolutely atrocious. This guy's approval rating is somewhere deep in the gutter. And it's been said quite often, I think, and it sounds a cruel thing to say, that the best thing John ever did for his dynasty was to die when he did. Because if he'd stayed on the throne much longer, it's likely that Louis of France would have beaten him, would have succeeded in becoming King of England, and we would then have had this odd position of kind of a reversal of what comes later in the 100 Years' War of England claiming the throne of France. And we would have had a French king sitting on the throne of both France and England, and that would have been John's legacy. But when he dies in 1216, he leaves behind a 9-year-old son. So Henry III comes to the throne at the age of 9. In the midst of this First Barons' War, complete and utter crisis, England is invaded. The southeast is in the control of the French. The north is in the control of rebel barons. His dad, John, wanted to be buried at Beaulieu Abbey, a place that he'd founded, and he ends up being buried at Worcester Cathedral because it's the best place that he can find that's still in royalist English hands. You can't get buried in London because it's in the hands of the French. He can't get to Beaulieu Abbey because it's in rebel hands. So he's at Worcester, and he's still there today as a kind of monument to his epic failure. But what John leaves behind is a very small group of people who he pleads with them in his will. His will is a tiny, tiny document that still exists at Worcester Cathedral. You can go and see copies of it there. And he pleads with this small group of people who are led by William Marshal. Now, ding, ding, William Marshal, surely everybody knows who he is, the greatest knight ever to have lived, a genuine legend in his own lifetime. Marshal is amongst those who is still sort of hanging around with John and willing to tolerate him a little bit. And John sort of singles William Marshal out and says, look, if anyone can save my dynasty and my throne and my son, it's you. So this small group of barons, can you get together, get behind my son and do what you can to save him? And so essentially these people get together and they decide that William Marshal is going to be regent, because obviously Henry is too young to do anything at the age of 9. So it falls to William Marshal to resolve this crisis that Henry has inherited. And what Marshal does very neatly is make the point to everybody immediately that given that their beef was with John is gone, and we now have a 9-year-old boy who's never upset anybody. He's not done anything wrong. And he kind of starts to ask this question: what are you fighting against now? What are you fighting for? You're fighting for a French prince who's invaded England. The cause of all of your upset is gone. And he very cleverly as well reissues Magna Carta. So these aren't the 1215 version of Magna Carta never gets anywhere near a statute book or anything like that. It's not a particularly important version of Magna Carta. It's issued again in the aftermath of John's death by William Marshal, and there's several other reissues. It's the 1225 one that ends up actually being the most important one that stays on the statute book. But William Marshal, again, takes the sting out of what the rebel barons are up to by reissuing Magna Carta and saying, all of those things that you were complaining about, you were kicking off because John wouldn't abide by Magna Carta. Well, here's a 9-year-old boy who is going to be bound by Magna Carta. So again, what are you fighting for now? So Henry is in many, many ways incredibly lucky that he has someone like William Marshal, who is not just a great military figure, but he's actually politically very astute as well. William Marshal will go and fight the Battle of Lincoln. He spots an opportunity in which the French and rebel baron forces are split in half. Half are in Lincoln and half are down on the south coast between London and Dover. And so he musters all of the forces he can get and attacks this half that are in Lincoln, manages to win the Battle of Lincoln in May 1217. And it's an unusual battle that's fought within the walls of the town of Lincoln. Marshal is victorious there, drives away the rebel forces, and we're told that only a tiny handful, single digits of important French noblemen make it back to London as a result of this. And he then fights well, no, actually, Sore Point. Marshal doesn't fight in the Battle of Sandwich in August 1217, which is a naval battle, because he wants to, but they won't let him, because by this point he's 70 years old. So everyone was a bit wary of him riding into battle at Lincoln. And there's a great story of Marshal kind of giving this rousing speech before the battle, and he spurs his horse forward to lead the charge, and a squire has to catch the reins of his horse and remind him that he's forgotten to put his helmet on. And there's a later bit in the battle where someone smacks Marshal over the head so much that his helmet is dented all over the place afterwards. So it's a good job this squire reminded him to put his helmet on. So when they get to the Battle of Sandwich, everyone is a bit like, do you know what? Maybe you should sit this one out, William. Just chill out, put your feet up. We'll get you a cup of cocoa. You can watch from the beach. And the English, again, win the Battle of Sandwich. They use some novel tactics of, they look like they're sort of running away from the French almost, but what they're trying to do is get round the back of them, catch the wind, and then they catch up with them, and they throw up into the air handfuls of quicklime powder from barrels. So quicklime is something that's used as mortar in medieval buildings quite often. So castles today, the mortar that you'll see there is most often quicklime, but it's also incredibly caustic. So if you get this in your eyes or anywhere that you're sweaty or whatever else, it burns like mad. So the English use this as a kind of chemical warfare. They get the wind behind them and they throw this up in the air. It gets into the eyes of the French fleet, the French sailors, burns, and they end up winning this huge battle. So 1217 then becomes this almost defining moment in the story, the emergence of an English identity, I guess, because up until now, England has been so connected to the continent and the French possessions, Normandy, and then the increased lands that Henry II bought too. And John has been the first king who's kind of lost most of that and been stuck in England. And this is sort of forcing this emergence of an idea of an English identity opposed to a French one. So we're resisting a French invasion now. It's a bit more kind of them and us. So Henry's reign, not really because of anything that Henry does because he's still a little boy at this point, but his reign for me starts to become about this real emergence of an English identity and a question of what it means to be English and to be a king of England. And what is the nation of England when it doesn't have all of those continental possessions that it's had for so long too. And those are parts, those are parts of the reasons right at the very beginning why I think Henry's reign is foundational, but it's also really, really interesting and fascinating and gets overlooked far too easily, I think.
It seems like it's so close to William the Conqueror, but yet it's not as close as we feel like it is it?
No, I mean, it's 150 years after the conquest, I guess, that he becomes king. So that doesn't feel like an awfully huge amount of time, but I guess it's the difference between now and 1875. It probably felt like a different world to them as it does to us. And English fortunes have kind of waxed and waned on the continent in that you've had Normandy. Normandy has almost been separated from the crown. It's come back to the crown during the anarchy. And then Henry II brings not only Normandy, but the huge Angevin Empire. Some of that is lost under Richard I when he's away in the Crusades. John then loses the rest of it through incompetence. And to say, there is now this redefining of the borders of England that is becoming disconnected from those possessions on the continent, which raises the question of, if we're not Anglo-Norman, what are we? We're just English now. Yeah.
Okay. So at some point, Henry has to get married, right? And when you get married, you have to form an alliance with somebody. So who did they look to when it came time for him to get married?
I mean, he's marrying a French princess. Maybe not.
Interesting, huh?
Not too surprising. So this is Eleanor of Provence. And this marriage doesn't actually take place till 1236. So Henry, by this point, is 28 years old. Eleanor is a 12-year-old girl. So fairly shocking age gap to us, at least. But, as a political alliance, it's a significant move for Henry. He seems to, there is a really interesting marginal drawing of Henry and Eleanor in a chronicle around the time of their wedding, where it's clear, this is a man talking to a little girl. But Henry seems to have taken, good care of Eleanor. They seem to have developed a really close relationship. And one of the aspects that I do think is interesting about Henry is that we often think about maybe Queen Victoria and Prince Albert inventing this idea of a family element to the royal institution, if you like. But I kind of think Henry and Eleanor were there a little bit earlier too, because one of the things that really stands out about Henry is just how much of a family man this guy is. They begin to have children a few years after they're married. So again, Eleanor is only around 15, 16 when she's starting to have children. The oldest of those is Edward, who is known as Lord Edward throughout his younger years, but is the man that history remembers best as Edward I, Longshanks. They have a daughter, Margaret, a daughter, Beatrice, another son, Edmund, and then a daughter called Catherine too. And Eleanor brings with her, the problem that Eleanor has, I guess, is that she, like so many other French or any other nation kind of princesses that come to England as a queen, she brings a lot of family with her. So these are the people often known as the Savoyard. So they're centered around Savoy. The reason we have the Savoy Hotel is because it's on the site of the Savoy Palace, which was built by one of Eleanor's relations. And so she becomes slightly unpopular because she's seen as the reason that a lot of these Savoyards or Poitevins or Lusignans, as they're variously known, begin to come over to England, and they begin to sort of hoover up the top government jobs, and they're getting lots of money and patronage from Henry. And it's that old balancing act that lots of medieval kings have to deal with of you've got a bunch of people who own a lot of property and say they're loyal to you, but what actually keeps them loyal to you, who knows? Or you've got this group of people who are your family or your wife's family or something like that, who you can lavish gifts on, and then they are dependent on you and you can rely on their loyalty an awful lot more. But that makes them deeply unpopular, and by extension makes the king and the queen deeply unpopular. So they've got a really nice family unit going on there, and there are lots and lots of instances of Henry caring for his family. So one of his daughters will be married to a king of Scotland, and when that king of Scotland, Alexander III, gets into a bit of trouble and is sort of kidnapped by his own nobles. So Alexander and Margaret, the one of Henry's daughter that's married to him, are sort of locked up and taken prisoner by the Scottish nobles. Henry sends a force north to go and free them. And this isn't about war with Scotland. This is about, hang on, you are not doing this to my daughter. I'm absolutely not putting up with this. We know that when Edward goes off on crusade, quite famously, Edward is away on crusade when his father actually dies. There are accounts in the chronicles of Henry, in floods of tears that his son is leaving, and that Henry is of such an advanced age that Edward is going to go and do something very, very dangerous in the Holy Land, and Henry is an old man, in this sense they might not see each other again, and you get this kind of tearful scene on the beaches at Dover of a father and son being separated and not being certain that they're ever going to see each other again. And you get from Edward as well, for all of his later reputation as a cruel man in Wales and Scotland in particular, he is incredibly tender towards his father. This is clearly a man who loves his dad a lot, and who also loves his mother. There is an instance in a rebellion against Henry when Londoners sort of turn on the royal family, and they try to get out of London, and Eleanor tries to row up the Thames. Well, she's not rowing. I mean, she's a queen. She's not rowing. Eleanor tries to be rowed up the Thames in a barge, and the Londoners are on bridges throwing stones and mud at her boat, so that she has to turn back and get back into the Tower of London. And it's widely believed that Edward's bad relationship with the city of London for the rest of his life and throughout his reign is caused by the fact that they did this to his mother, and he won't tolerate them behaving in that way to his mom. So you do get, I think you can see a really close-knit family who aren't afraid of showing some emotion around each other, and that they care for each other in a way that is, we don't quite often think about this in the medieval world. I think we're often talking about sons and brothers attacking each other and hating on each other and constantly at each other's throats. And I think here in Henry III, you've got him, literally sending men to go and save his daughter from imprisonment in a foreign country in Scotland, and you've got his son, loving his mother so much that he falls out with an entire city for the rest of his life because of the way they treat her. And they say this tearful scene on the beach of the father and son being separated and not being sure when they'll see each other again. And particularly through Henry's later reign, he will lean on Edward an awful lot. And Edward is there. Edward is presented with several opportunities to turn against his father, not least around Simon de Montfort is a huge figure in the reign of Henry III. And he's also Edward's uncle and godfather. So there are several opportunities for Edward to have turned against his father, but he is so reluctant to do so, and it feels like that's because he just genuinely loves his dad.
Honestly, my impression of Edward I is just this terribly mean man.
I think, what that impression, I think, comes from after the death of his wife. Him and his wife are so close, and I think all of the stuff that you see him doing later in his reign, which attracts the most intense bad publicity today, happens after his wife has died. And it's almost like she has been, that softening influence on him, and when she's gone, he just loses it and turns into a bit of a monster, really. So again, that family element, I think, remains with Edward too.
It's so fascinating to me. I see this repeated over and over in history, and of course I have to bring up Thomas Seymour, but after Catherine Parr died, he changed too. It's like there's something about these wives that ground these men, and when they're removed from the picture, they just go off the rails. Like they don't know how to behave properly anymore.
Yeah, I think so. And it shows us the influence of women, where we feel like we can't see the power that women exerted in medieval England and early modern England. Here are the demonstrations of it, because what you can see there is the effect of that woman no longer being there, that restraining, that sort of softening aspect. Once it's removed, allows these men to become the worst version of themselves, where their wives seem to have been helping them to become the best version of themselves.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. Okay, one of the things about Henry III that I think we've talked about before on this show, but it was many, many, many years ago, was the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey. And can we talk about that and what happened to Westminster Abbey first and why he rebuilt it?
I mean, nothing happened to it. He rebuilt it because he's utterly, utterly obsessed with Edward the Confessor. Henry is a huge builder. There are so many. Salisbury Cathedral dates from his reign. There is a lot going on during Henry's reign. Where I live near Bridge North, there's if you can find it in Lowtown in Bridge North, there's a tiny plaque at the side of the road which you will almost miss if you're not looking for it, that marks the spot of an old priory where Henry gave a whole load of timbers for the roofing and the rebuilding of that priory. He's really keen on building. So even out here, near the borders with Wales, he's donating royal timber from Royal Forest to help build religious institutions, religious buildings. He loves building. If you go to the Tower of London today, the vast majority of what you look at is Henry III's work, completed by Edward I. So before him, you'd largely got the White Tower with a wall around the outside. All of those extra towers and walls, setting aside the later kind of Tudor buildings, because obviously they come a long time after Henry. But the layout of the Tower of London as it is today, with the curtain walls around the outside and the towers, the Wakefield Towers and all of those kinds of things, that's Henry III. He built that. And it was finished by his son, Edward I. So again, when we look around so much of London, so many of those iconic landmarks, we're looking at the work of Henry III. We're looking at the vision of Henry III. And Westminster Abbey is, I think he would have considered that his crowning achievement, his greatest glory. He is obsessed with Edward the Confessor. I mean, hence the reason his oldest son is called Edward. Edward is not, an English name that's in use at this point. It's very not an Anglo-Norman name. And he seems to have named Edward after Edward the Confessor. So this saint king of Anglo-Saxon England, Henry III is really harking back to him. So Westminster Abbey, as it existed in Henry III's day, was a building that was built by Edward the Confessor. Now, almost certainly it was overdue refurbishment by this point. There's lots of architectural progression that's been made since then, and Henry is really keen on building these huge monuments in stone. So he sets about rebuilding Westminster Abbey, and he puts Edward the Confessor right at the centre of it. So you look at that central position in Westminster Abbey that Edward the Confessor's tomb has today. That's because Henry III put him there, right in the middle of the building, right front and centre. And it gets a little bit weird too, because Henry had Edward the Confessor kind of dug up and moved to that position after 200 years in his tomb. And Henry left instructions that he was to be buried in the space where Edward the Confessor's body had been for 200 years. So that's a little bit weird, a little bit creepy. But, that's the extent of his kind of reverence of this Saint King of England. And I think it tells us a lot about how Henry wanted himself to be seen, that he was trying to echo the achievements of Edward the Confessor, not least in being named a saint. He's a contemporary of Louis IX of France who becomes a saint. And I think Henry III would have gone absolutely nuts if he found out that Louis gets made a saint and he doesn't. He would have absolutely hated that. So yeah, and he spends most of the rest of his life having Westminster Abbey rebuilt. And again, most of what you look at today, obviously you've got the Lady Chapel is Henry VII's edition. Obviously it's continually undergoing reworking and everything else. But the bones of the Westminster Abbey that you see today was given to us by Henry III, and his obsession, his dedication to building and creating these huge monuments. The Cosmati pavement in Westminster Abbey. So this is the bit in front of the altar where coronations take place. So the big kind of mosaic pavement in there that they normally won't let you walk on if you visit Westminster Abbey, but you can get up the steps and look at it. That was laid, again, it wasn't laid by Henry III, like Eleanor wasn't rowing up the Thames. It was created on the instruction of Henry III. He's not kneeling down and laying all of those tiles himself.
I'd love that.
But he's hiring, I think he should have. But he's hiring the Italian tradesmen and artisans to come in and create this Cosmati pavement, which tells the story of the universe. It tells the story of the creation of the universe, and it gives us time spans for the life of different kind of animals and stuff, and tries to extrapolate from this the length of the universe. But essentially, what you've got there is a pavement that encapsulates the entire universe and all of time and all of space, on which Henry envisaged kings of England being crowned for all eternity, and they have been crowned on that spot ever since, on that Cosmati pavement that he created. So again, you think in terms of legacy.
Yeah.
And this is a man who, we can thank for what we see of the Tower of London mostly today. Most of what we see of Westminster Abbey today, the Cosmati pavement on which 800 years of monarchs have been crowned, was created by Henry III. So again, there are some things. He doesn't happen to win a massive victory in a battle against the French like Henry V does, but he's achieving a heck of a lot during his lifetime.
Yeah. Okay, so I have to ask, where did he get the money to pay for this stuff? Like, it seems like a massive undertaking.
I think the thing is, Henry is not prosecuting wars, and that's what most kings are spending all of their money on. That's what they're trying to raise taxation for all of the time, is to pay for war with foreign nations. And one of the reasons that I'll say I think Henry would be someone who you might want as a leader of your country today is that this is a man who is making peace with people who have traditionally been enemies all over the place. So I mentioned, his one daughter is married to Alexander III of Scotland. And we see throughout Henry's reign then this long period of peace and friendship between England and Scotland. They are going backwards and forwards. Alexander and Henry are going backwards and forwards over the border, going to Christmas parties at each other's houses. They are getting on incredibly well. We don't have war between England and Scotland for just about the whole of Henry III's reign. It's his son Edward I who's going to pick that fight again a little bit later.
Yeah.
And the same sort of thing happens with France. So Henry, his dad has lost all of the territory in France. And he does have this moment where he launches a campaign in France, and he's like, I think he feels encumbered by this idea that he has to get these lands back. So he does have a go at it, and he's not very good at it. Henry's not a soldier. He has a go. It doesn't go very well for him. He's almost captured by the French and just manages to escape. But by kind of 1259, he signs the Treaty of Paris, in which he gives up the English claim to all of the territories in France apart from Gascony, in return for recognition of his right to rule Gascony, not as a vassal of the King of France. So he's kind of removing. I mean, you can see this as a huge capitulation of a kind of final giving up of what John had already lost. But you can also see it as just a recognition of the fact that that land is lost and is virtually impossible to get back at this point. And what he can get is certainty around Gascony and give away, a nominal paper right that he claims to have to lands that he probably knows he's never going to be able to get back. And what you see then is, again, long periods of peace throughout his reign, aside from when he goes on this campaign to try and get those lands back. Long periods of peace with France throughout his reign. And as I mentioned, he's a contemporary of Louis IX, who goes on to become a saint. And they seem to have an awful lot in common. They seem to get on really, really well. They're both more interested in religious aspects than they are in war. And so in many ways, I think these are the really quiet successes of Henry's reign. He can afford to spend his money on building Westminster Abbey and donating money to new constructions around his kingdom, because he's not spending it all on pursuing wars that he simply can't win. For all of the glory that might have come with Henry V's victory at Agincourt, what does it actually achieve? Nothing. It embroils England in a war that it can never afford and doesn't ever win. So, and the same, with Edward III when he kicks off the 100 Years' War. So for me, there is a lot to be said for Henry's interest in peace, his willingness to take the criticism that goes with not, bashing the Scots and bashing the French and bashing the Welsh. He recognises, towards the end of his reign, he recognises Llywelyn the Last in Wales as the Prince of Wales. Llywelyn is the last Prince of Wales recognised by an English king. It will be, Edward I will take that title for his son, the future Edward II, as a way of reinforcing his conquest of Wales afterwards. Henry III is willing to say, do you know what? You're ruling Wales. That's fine. You're Prince of Wales. Absolutely fine. And now Llywelyn does homage to Henry III, but otherwise Henry kind of leaves him alone. And again, it's Edward I who will kind of see that kick off again. You can question whether that's Edward's fault or Llywelyn's fault or whatever else. But nevertheless, I think, England goes through this period of Henry's reign of large, huge chunks of peace against people who had traditionally been their enemies. Scotland, Wales and France, England have been fighting them for centuries before and for centuries after. But here is a time when actually the leaders of those nations are getting on, are recognising each other's positions, and are just trying to live in peace.
Wow. Okay. So, we always talk about how Henry III seems so overlooked. And to me, it seems so obvious now because he was a peaceful king. And during his reign, I'm sure he wanted some type of legacy. Obviously, he would have loved to be named a saint. But it's interesting to me how history works out that way. When someone is a peaceful ruler, they're not remembered as well as someone like Henry V, who wasn't as peaceful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's an element there of, what medieval people expected from their monarchs. They expected them to deliver military victory and glory abroad. But those were quite often these kind of abstract things. They didn't necessarily benefit people in England very much. What you got was taxed even more to pay for those wars. It was the elites who got rich from those wars for the most part. And I think we still have that view of medieval history today, that the successful kings are the ones that lead successful military campaigns and who defeat the most enemies. Whereas that, that's not what we would want from a ruler of our nations today. We don't expect them to go and start massive foreign wars just to make themselves feel better. So we maybe need to think again about what we think of as a good and a bad medieval king. There are many ways in which Edward II is not a good medieval king, but he's actually, I don't think he's as bad as history has painted him either. He's a guy who's just seems like a really nice guy who's just trying to get on with something he's not all that interested in, really. So whereas I think Henry III is someone who is interested in being king. He absolutely is trying to be a good king, but in the mold of Edward the Confessor, not in the mold of William the Conqueror. He is trying to be. I mean, so medieval thinkers tended to identify two good versions of a king. There is the military leader, in biblical terms, the King David, the one who is delivering the military victories, and there is the peaceful man, the sort of philosopher figure. So in biblical terms, the King Solomon. And this is the Edward the Confessor that I think Henry III is trying to identify with. He knows he's not some great military leader. He's not interested in that side of things. But he thinks maybe he could be the great, philosophical thinker king and make himself a saint in this way and deliver peace. And I think for great chunks of his reign, he does deliver peace. He's often described, I mean, there's one chronicle that describes Henry as a simplex, which is a tricky Latin word, because it can mean that he was a bit stupid, that he was a bit simple, that he was a bit naive, but it can also just mean that he was peaceful, that he wasn't looking to pick fights all over the place. So again, it's some of those words are difficult to get to the bottom of what the person who wrote it meant, because they can mean several different things. And again, that's not to say that Henry's reign isn't without its troubles, because he's king for 56 years and you spend that long on the throne, you're going to face problems. So I mentioned before, Simon de Montfort is a figure who looms large in Henry's reign, and his reign will see the Second Barons' War. So, he inherits the First Barons' War from his dad, but his reign will also see the Second Barons' War and a period of kind of civil war, driven really by Simon de Montfort. And Henry struggles to deal with that, but almost every king faces some kind of internal rebellion or revolt that they struggle to deal with from time to time. And if you're going to spend 56 years on the throne like Henry does, then you're undoubtedly going to face one. But yeah, Simon de Montfort, again, a really interesting figure who most people could probably tell you more about Simon de Montfort than Henry III. He's those kind of one of those figures that dominates and looms over Henry's reign and probably pushes Henry into the shadow a little bit. And he's interesting in his own right, but I find Simon de Montfort quite a difficult, troublesome figure. He's quite often held up as this father of kind of parliamentary democracy. Well, he's not. I mean, we haven't even talked about Parliament. Parliament is a big legacy of Henry III's reign. Parliament comes into existence. The first meeting of Parliament is in Henry III's reign, and it emerges as a body that will grant taxation to the crown for projects that the crown wants to undertake, whether that's foreign war or internal defence or whatever it is, in return for reforms of the king's behaviour against what it sees as breaches of Magna Carta, so the Great Charter. And that's the kind of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours that Parliament starts off as. And Henry is utterly accepting of this. Parliament only emerges and grows because Henry is willing to accept this kind of check and balance on his power and his authority. But it's kind of a few years before Simon de Montfort kicks off his rebellion that you see the first elections to Parliament. It's a few years before that there is a representation sent from the shires, so it's not just the Lords, the Commons begins to emerge too. So those are all things that are already emerging when Simon de Montfort arrives. So the idea that he kind of pioneers parliamentary democracy in elections simply isn't true. The novelty that you see in Simon de Montfort's Parliament is that Simon asks Parliament for its opinion and input into policy. So whereas previously the king had been asking for taxation and Parliament had been asking him to reform the way that he behaves, now Simon is saying, okay, so if I wanted to go and pick a war with the French, what would you think about that kind of thing? He's actually asking for active feedback. And so that's a novelty. That's a development in the role of Parliament that comes about from Simon. But I would also say that probably happens because Simon is so short of support that he's desperately trying to get people on his side, and is looking for ways to kind of pack Parliament with people who back him and then get them on his side for the things that he needs them to do for him by offering him these kind of extra perks and privileges. So there is a bit of an advancement in the powers of Parliament under Simon de Montfort, but not the kind of huge foundational stuff that Simon is often credited with. I mean, Simon is a difficult figure. He comes from a crusading family. So his dad and his brothers have been involved in the Albigensian Crusade in the south of France against the Cathars. He's too young to take part in that. And I've suggested, in my book, I kind of suggest that Simon views political reform in England as his version of a crusade. It's kind of a cause that he can latch onto and really fight for. And he goes a bit too far in it. He's incredibly anti-Semitic as well. He kicks all of the Jews out of Leicester when he becomes Earl of Leicester. He encourages attacks on Jews in London when he's in power briefly. So he will. He has a fractious relationship with Henry. He marries one of Henry's sisters, so they become brothers-in-law. And then they have fallings out. Then they make up, they break up, they make up, they break up. Henry sends him off to go and rule Gascony for him, and then tells him what a terrible job he's doing, and has shouting matches with Simon on one occasion in the entranceway to a church. He bars Simon from going into church and kind of screams and shouts at him. And you get these kind of provisions of Oxford being put in front of Henry as an effort to reform his behaviour further than Magna Carta, and Henry unhelpfully kind of almost mimicking the behaviour of his dad. He kind of agrees to the provisions of Oxford and then tears them up as soon as everyone has left the room, which is not a great move, Henry, at all. Should have learnt the lessons. So that's 1258, you have that. 1259, you get the provisions of Westminster, which is again Simon sort of pushing reforms onto Henry. And this time you find Edward, so Prince Edward is kind of backing the provisions of Westminster, believing that his father ought to kind of sign them. And Henry then goes to the Pope and asks for permission to wheedle out of the provisions of both Oxford and Westminster, which is exactly what his dad had done. And, he's now getting dangerously like the behaviour that his father had exhibited. And all of this kind of ends up in warfare. So you get, again, the lead up to this is slightly odd in that Henry decides to place his dispute with Simon de Montfort before the King of France, before Louis, to have it judged. And this is really weird for a King of England to do, to put an internal feud with one of his liegemen before the King of France for judgment. Simon doesn't go to hear the results of this case. He's got to know he's going to lose. No king is going to back, an earl against another king. Although Simon does have a good excuse because he's broken his leg falling off his horse. So he's like, I would come, but my leg. And unsurprisingly, Louis finds in favour of Henry, and this is what ultimately leads to the breakout of military trouble. So May 1264, you get the Battle of Lewes, where Simon attacks Henry's forces at Lewes on the south coast, and Simon's broken leg kind of comes back into play here because he is in a carriage because he still can't ride. He's in a carriage, and Lord Edward, who is on his father's side again by this point, goes to assault this carriage. He's out for blood. He's after Simon, and he gets to this carriage, breaks it open, and finds kind of an elderly couple from London inside, probably having a cup of tea and a nervous sandwich, going hi. And it turns out that Simon is actually well enough to ride a horse, and he's on the other side of the army, and he's tricked Edward. So Edward's forces are being sort of led away from the battle, chasing these Londoners, as Simon leads a charge from the other side, attacks Henry, and they end up taking Henry III hostage. His son Edward, when he comes back to the battlefield, surrenders and is taken hostage. Henry's brother is taken hostage too. And I mean, we haven't even mentioned his brother Richard. He's such a fascinating character, the Earl of Cornwall, who is also by this point he is the King of the Romans. So Holy Roman Emperor in all but name. He's the only Englishman ever to become the King of the Romans. Oh. He's taken hostage, and his son is also taken hostage as well, Richard's son. So Simon has control of the government, and this lasts for about a year, because Simon has kind of come to power on this anti-corruption ticket. Aren't all of those Poitevin relatives of the Queen absolutely dreadful? Shouldn't be allowed. And what he immediately does is start giving all of the key offices in England loads of money and loads of land to his sons. So everyone is like, hang on. This isn't what we thought we were getting. So Simon manages to alienate people really, really quickly, which is why he's desperate for this support in Parliament when Parliament sits. And all of this is turned around again in August 1265. So just over a year later, you get the Battle of Evesham, when Simon is defeated by forces that are led by Lord Edward, so Prince Edward, who has escaped from custody. And even this is a great story. So Edward is being held at a castle near the Welsh borders, again in my neck of the woods, and he's allowed out to go and exercise and go riding and everything every once in a while. This all goes fine for a while, and one day they decide to take a load of the horses out to practice riding, and they're kind of driving these horses really fast backwards and forwards up and down the field till they're all absolutely exhausted. And Edward's guards are joining in. They're all having a great time. And then Edward gets on the last fresh horse and says, right, thanks, guys. See ya. And rides off. And they're all standing there with these sweaty, panting horses. Yeah. And you can just imagine them all looking at each other going, oh, dear. Someone's got to go and tell Simon what's just happened.
We've been duped.
Edward, manages to escape, raises this army, goes and fights Simon at Evesham. Again, like he had done at Lewes, he sends a death squad to go and get Simon. There's a small group of knights who are told, you have no job on the battlefield but to go and kill Simon de Montfort. I want him dead. And they do, and he is killed. His body is dismembered. Parts of it are cut off fairly horrifically. His head is cut off and claimed by Roger Mortimer, and Roger sends it back to Wigmore Castle to his wife Maud as a present. So next time you get a snow globe, just be grateful that it's not a severed head to put on the mantelpiece. I've often wondered what do you do with that when it turns up? Does it go on top of the Christmas tree? Does it go on the fireplace?
Bizarre.
Yeah, a bizarre present to send for your wife, but So Simon is defeated. It takes a little while longer to quell all of the rebels, particularly Simon's sons. But Edward will again be kind of critical to this. He's freed his dad. He's sort of won the kingdom back, and Henry will spend kind of the remaining 7 or 8 years of his reign really leaning heavily on Edward at this point. And this is great training and practice for Edward to become king eventually. And again, I think for me, in all of this, you're seeing someone in Henry who is providing this bridge, and it's not glamorous in many ways, but he is this bridge between the absolute chaos of John's reign, in which England very nearly ceases to be an independent kingdom and becomes a fiefdom of France, is on the verge of having a French king, to the reign of Edward, who becomes king while he's off on crusade, comes back, will end up conquering Wales, conquering Scotland in ways that, for the Scots and the Welsh are obviously deeply, deeply unpopular. But for the English, they're viewing this as a victory. And it's in many ways, it's the reign of Henry III that has restored the foundation that allows Edward to go and do all of this external stuff. Edward would love to have had more war with France as well, but the Welsh and the Scots keep getting in the way of that. So Henry is someone for me who has kind of righted the ship that John has left, on rocky waves, and hands it over to Edward on smooth waters. Now, I don't think he's necessarily responsible for what Edward does with that, because Henry was much more interested in peace than he was with war, and I'm not sure he'd have been happy with what his son does with the peace that he's handed to him. But nevertheless, he is, you know, his reign sees all of those problems kind of smoothed out, solved, resolved, and a period of peace with many of England's traditional enemies that it's hard to see anywhere else in the medieval period, to be honest.
Does Henry die an old man in his bed, like, or does he fall ill? How does his end look? I honestly don't really feel like I know anything about him.
Yeah, so we're kind of 1265. We've had the Battle of Evesham. It's kind of 1266 and 1267 is spent mopping up the problems with the rebels. You get the dictum of Kenilworth. And 1267, you also get that Treaty of Montgomery that recognises Llewellyn as Prince of Wales. And then in 1270, so a few years after all of this has settled down, is when Edward goes off on crusade. And Henry, by this point, so by 1270, he's kind of 63 years old. It's a pretty old man for a medieval king. His health seems to have been sort of failing a little bit, and I think that's why you get this sense of that parting on the beach where, you know, yes, Edward is going off to the crusade, which is incredibly dangerous, but also Henry is an old man, and Edward is going to necessarily be gone for a period of time, probably years, and they may well not see each other again. And one of the other things that, just before we get to Henry's final end, one of the other things that he has put in place is something, again, that brings to an end centuries of chaos. So before Henry III's reign, when a monarch dies, you get this period of an interregnum before the next one is crowned. So it's not until the coronation of the next monarch. And that's the space into which, you know, Henry I has previously jumped when he pinches the crown when William Rufus dies. It's caused the anarchy when Stephen gets crowned, when Matilda was nominated as Henry I's heir. This interregnum has always been a problem. And Henry resolves that. So it is him that creates this idea that the king is dead, long live the king. He has it enacted in law that in the moment that the king dies, his heir succeeds him and effectively becomes king immediately without the need for a coronation. And that means that Edward can be away on crusade when his dad passes away. So we get a couple of letters that go backwards and forwards to the Holy Land. Henry writes to Edward to say that he's really ill and he's in bed and he fears he's not going to recover. And he does sort of rally for 6 months or so after that letter, but his health is increasingly getting worse and worse. And so he dies in November 1272. He dies at Westminster in his bed, an old man still wearing the crown of England, even after 56 years as king.
Not literally,
yes,
though.
Probably not literally. It might have been a bit uncomfortable. Dies in 1272. Immediately on his death, Edward becomes king. So Edward doesn't actually return to England till 1274. So it's 2 years after his father's death that he comes back, which would have been a crisis in any previous monarch's reign. But because of the way that Henry has changed the law, it no longer is a crisis, and Edward is able to remain on crusade for a while. Henry is buried in the tomb that is vacated by Edward the Confessor. Yuck. Slightly weird. Although it's not that long after, in 1290, that Edward I actually has his father's remains removed and put in a different tomb where they are now in Westminster Abbey. And in 1292, Henry's body is exhumed again, and his heart is removed. And by heart, they normally mean entrails, so the gooey bits. But they say that his heart is removed and reburied at Fontevraud Abbey to be amongst his Angevin ancestors. So Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard the Lionheart, and Henry III's mom, King John's wife, are buried there. So he doesn't quite get to rest where he'd always wanted to rest. But for me, this is a man who rules for 1216 to 1272, most of the 13th century in England. I say becomes king at 9, and despite being a child king, dies wearing the crown 56 years later. He doesn't lose the crown. I mean, yes, he suffers problems with Simon de Montfort and is sort of imprisoned for a year. But nevertheless dies wearing the crown at the age of 65, having changed England so much. I mean, in terms of its institutions, Parliament didn't exist when Henry became king, and is a growing and strengthening institution by the time that he dies, and one that still exists in Britain today. We only have that because of Henry III's reign. The idea of automatic succession is created by Henry III to remove the problems and issues that had dogged the English crown for centuries before Henry's reign. We've got this unprecedented period of peace with traditional enemies, and just the fabric of England. Like I say, you go to London today and you visit the Tower of London, you are looking at Henry III's work. You go and visit Westminster Abbey and you are looking at Henry III's work. So if we're trying to think of a medieval king with a legacy, I mean, hello, Parliament, the automatic right of succession of kings, the Tower of London and Westminster Abbey aren't bad starts for a king that most people have never heard of.
No. Wow. Okay, Matt. I feel like I know Henry III so much better after our conversation today. And I think everybody listening or watching probably feels the same way. So I'm going to make sure to include a link in the show notes to your book. But I also want to ask you if you'll come back and talk about Edward I with me, because that is a reign that I want to learn more about too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Happy to talk about Edward.
I love it. Matt Lewis, thank you so much. And before we go, I want you to be able to tell everybody about your podcast as well.
Yes, thank you. So you can find me on Gone Medieval. So I host one episode of that a week. Eleanor Yarniger does the one that goes out on a Tuesday. I do the one that goes out on a Friday. I also host Echoes of History, which is a podcast attached to the Assassin's Creed franchise of games. So we look at the history behind the Assassin's Creed games, which is fascinating because it gets me out of just medieval stuff and get to learn about all sorts of different things. And yeah, I've got a Substack. If you can subscribe to my Substack and get sort of blog newsletters from me every once in a while. And there's a few books floating around that I've written as well, if anyone would care to read any of them.
Yeah. And for anybody who thinks that you're just Richard III historian or expert, I think today you proved to the world that you are far more than that. Your knowledge of medieval history, and I think just English history or British history in general, is quite vast. And I feel like you're probably one of those people who's constantly learning too, aren't you?
I think so. I think, I'm definitely a Richard III nerd. There's no way I'm shying away from that. Yeah. But, I've written about the anarchy and Henry III and Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. And I find all of those things absolutely fascinating. And you're right. I always want to learn more. And I think there is always more that you can learn. And there are fascinating figures like Henry III who maybe don't get the attention that they deserve, who I'm always interested to learn more about.
Matt, thank you so much. And then next time we'll talk about Edward I.
I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Tudors Dynasty and Beyond. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss a new release. And if you loved it, leave a quick review. It helps more history lovers find the show. Want to support the podcast and get bonus content? Head to patreon.com/tudorsdynasty. You can also find the link in the show notes of this episode. You can also join the conversation with me on social media @Tudors Dynasty. Until next time, thanks for keeping history alive with me.